Thank you, everyone. This morning, I have the pleasure of introducing Anna Drewry. She's one of our chief residents. She's been here in Madison for a very long time. So she did her undergraduate here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in biology, and then medical school here, and has been serving as one of our residents for the past 4 years. Today, she's going to be talking about sterilization, which I'm sure will be a very interesting topic. So thank you.
All right, I haven't used this type of mic before. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. I feel like I'm on a TED Talk, so. All right, so good morning, and thank you for that introduction. Today I'm here to talk to you about sterilization in the United States. All right. So I have no legal, financial, or industry disclosures. One thing that has come up as I prepared this topic, and actually came up in our recent Ob-Gyn book club, is the balance or fine line between appropriation and allyship. And in that case, we had been talking about HIV in Chicago. That was the book we had been reading in the 1980s. But I think it bears keeping in mind today for this presentation as well, that these are these women's stories. Also, if anyone has questions or comments throughout the presentation, please feel free to ask as we go along. No need to wait for the end. So in the following 40 minutes, I hope to accomplish 3 goals. The first, I would like to review the historical context of the modern-day Medicaid sterilization policy in this country. Second, I wish to critically review the laws in regard to the current medical and ethical implications. And finally, I hope to offer both long-term and immediate solutions to improve the care that we offer our patients. So let's start at the beginning. Before we examine the historical intricacies and current complexities surrounding sterilization procedures, I think it is important to consider the medical facts around the procedure we are discussing today. Simply put, this is a procedure in which part or all of the fallopian tubes are removed. This, like any other surgical procedure, carries the risk of infection, bleeding, damage to other structures, as well as the risks of anesthesia. The purposes for removal of the fallopian tubes can be multiple. It can be a form of contraception, to reduce ovarian cancer, prevention of pelvic infection, or to improve pregnancy outcomes in assisted reproductive technology. Current Medicaid policies regarding sterilization are based in federal law, although each state may modify the Title 19 policy within the confines of federal regulation, which can add a level of complexity for healthcare practitioners. Fundamental requirements of this form include a waiting period of at least 30 days from signing to sterilization, as well as an expiration date of not more than 180 days. Persons wishing to be sterilized must be at least 21 years of age and appear to be, quote, mentally competent. Exemptions to these requirements are in the cases of emergent abdominal surgery or preterm delivery. In the case of preterm delivery, the waiting period is shortened to 72 hours, with the caveat that the signature must have been obtained at least 30 days from the expected due date. As with most things, our current state is not random, but it is the product of the lessons learned in previous decades. As we start to review the history of sterilization in the United States, I think it is worth a minute to go over the ethical principles that guide patient care: non-malfeasance, beneficence, justice, and respect for autonomy. Many of these ideas are at the foundation of medicine. The Hippocratic Oath from the 2nd century pledges to, quote, abstain from all intentional wrongdoing and harm, or in later versions known as do no harm, and is represented here by the tenet of non-malfeasance. Beneficence is our obligation to do what is best for the patient, and justice reminds us the importance of fairness in medical decisions. Perhaps most central to the topic at hand, however, is the principle of autonomy. Autonomy can be interpreted in different ways. This can be the responsibility in a negative or passive sense that our actions should not interfere with the choices of others. It can also be interpreted as a positive obligation and that we have a responsibility to enable or enhance our patients' decisions. Freedom of reproductive decisions, however, has not always been a fundamental right in the United States. In the 1800s, reproductive rights of women with intellectual disabilities were heavily regulated. At that time, surgical sterilization was not a feasible option, and therefore it was not uncommon that people were institutionalized during their reproductive years. Pictured here is one such institution, St. Elizabeth's in DC. Laws were also in effect which prohibited the marriage of persons with intellectual disabilities. In 1853, the first abdominal hysterectomy with a surviving patient was completed in Massachusetts. Nevertheless, the morbidity and mortality for surgery continued to be high in this pre-penicillin era. Due to these concerns, surgical sterilization was not commonplace until more minimally invasive surgical techniques were developed early in the 20th century, which were safer for the patient. With these new procedures, 17 laws passed states that allowed for and sometimes required sterilization of persons with intellectual disabilities. Perhaps most infamous of this is the Virginia Sterilization Act of 1924. This here is a map from 1929 that was actually prepared by the Swedish government, which shows the sterilization practices by state. Does anyone know who this person is? Do you want to say?
I think she was the first one who was denied to Blanche for mental health. There was mental health, and then we see that she went back in the Supreme Court. There was some.
Yeah. So this
treatment.
this is Carrie Buck. She was a resident of the state of Virginia, and the plaintiff in a legal dispute of Buck versus Bell. She's pictured here with her mother. Carrie had her daughter Vivian when she was 17 years old. She was institutionalized shortly thereafter at the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. And she was scheduled to undergo surgical sterilization on the basis that she was, quote, feeble-minded. This plan for her sterilization led to an appeal of the 1924 Virginia Sterilization Act in the circuit, followed by the district and eventually the U.S. Supreme Court. This is a pedigree that the Eugenics Records Office prepared for Carrie Buck's family for that trial. You can see her mother, Carrie herself, and then her 8-month-old daughter, Vivian. This, along with other records prepared, was sufficient that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 8-1 in favor of upholding the Virginia law and proceeding with Carrie's sterilization. The court opinion stated that Carrie was, quote, the probable parent of socially inadequate offspring, likewise afflicted, and that she may be sexually sterilized without detriment to her general health, and that of her welfare and that of society would be promoted by her sterilization. They also reference that the principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover the cutting of the fallopian tubes. Carrie was sterilized at the age of 21. Pictured here is Vivian Buck. This is Carrie's infant daughter with her appointed guardian. Eventually, Carrie was released from the Virginia State Colony, and her daughter developed normally until the age of 8 when she died from measles. Go back one. Later on, it became apparent that, like Vivian, Carrie did not, in fact, have intellectual disabilities. Instead, she had been institutionalized by her foster family in an attempt to hide her pregnancy, which was the result of a sexual assault by a member of her foster family. Although they did not succeed in having Carrie admitted to the Lynchburg colony until after her delivery, their initial efforts to admit her began once her pregnancy became apparent. In the years following this decision, a total of 30 states passed sterilization laws. These were used to sterilize more than 60,000 people, including another member of the Buck family. Carrie's sister was hospitalized in 1928 for appendicitis. During her appendectomy, she was also sterilized without her knowledge or consent. She did not find out until 50 years later. On the 75th anniversary of this landmark court decision, the General Assembly of Virginia passed House Joint Resolution 299. This was to honor the memory of Carrie Buck and also to formally apologize for the state's actions. Mark Warner, which is the governor of Virginia, issued a formal apology, and they erected a historical marker in Carrie's hometown of Charlottesville, Virginia. Over the next 2 years, eugenics rose to prominence under Nazi Germany. At the same time, in the United States, the tide began to turn in favor of reproductive rights. In 1942, one of the first court decisions was made favoring reproductive rights. This Supreme Court decision did not overturn Buck versus Bell in preventing sterilization for those with intellectual disability. Rather, this ruling was the first decision that punitive sterilization could be unlawful. Although punitive sterilization represented a minority of the cases since Buck versus Bell was passed, This still set a precedence for reproductive rights in the years to come. In this court opinion, Justice William O. Douglas, pictured here, wrote that, quote, "The power to sterilize, if exercised, may have subtle, far-reaching, and devastating effects. He is forever deprived of a basic liberty. The judges advise that a strict scrutiny of the classification which a state makes in a sterilization law is essential." Starting in the 1960s, states with sterilization laws began to repeal that legislation or codify them to include a judicial review process. Justice Douglas also wrote the majority court opinion in Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965. This case is best known for establishing the right to privacy, which was instrumental in access to contraception, but also played an important role in other aspects of reproductive freedom. Despite the legal changes in the preceding decade, there were still numerous reports of forced sterilization. One example was a case brought to the United States District Court by a 27-year-old woman from North Carolina. She reported at the age of 18, she was pressured by her social worker to undergo a temporary sterilization procedure in order to maintain her welfare benefits. She underwent a bilateral self-injectomy, which she did not come to understand was permanent until 5 years later. This was one example of how sterilization was used against women in poverty or those who relied on government assistance. Minnie and Mary Ralph were also the victims of forced sterilization in Montgomery, Alabama. These 12 and 14-year-old girls both underwent tubal ligations after their mother, who was illiterate, signed a consent form under the impression she was authorizing her daughters to get Depo-Provera. It was only after their father discovered their surgical scars that he sued the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, now called the Department of Health and Human Services, with the help of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Ultimately, this case led to prohibition of federal funding for involuntary sterilization and outlawed coerced sterilization by threatening loss of welfare benefits. This case also highlighted the disproportionate number of African American women who were forced to undergo sterilization procedures. Another group of women who were the focus of forced sterilization procedures were Native American women. They were more vulnerable due to dependence on federal funding, unique legal situation, and cultural factors. One such example was Norma Jean Serena, a 37-year-old who underwent postpartum sterilization on the same day she delivered her third child. She eventually filed a civil suit on the basis of abuse of her reproductive rights, stating she did not want a sterilization. During her court case, it was discovered that she did not even sign the consent for her sterilization until the day after her surgery. Although Ms. Serena lost her case, it generated publicity, which prompted investigations into sterilization cases of Native American women, which were being performed at much higher than expected rates and without adequate informed consent. Gradually, the process of informed consent took shape. One of the key steps in this process was the result of another ruling in the 1970s, which was a result of a class action lawsuit brought by 10 Latina women against the LA County Hospital. This established that the consent forms must be made available in multiple languages. These women filed their case after undergoing sterilization procedures without adequate consent or consent under duress, such as withholding pain medication in labor. This story was the focus of the 2015 documentary, No Mas Bebes. Finally, in 1976, regulations were established by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which set the standards for sterilization, which are still in use today. This included a prohibition of sterilization of mentally incompetent persons, an age limit, as well as a waiting period. At first, the waiting period was 72 hours, but this was extended 2 years later to the 30 days we know today. This new policy was welcomed as an appropriate safeguard against further reproductive injustices. A 1977 editorial in the New York Times read, quote, "We feel obligated to take favorable notice when the department acts wisely on behalf of poor women." While these were the changes happening at a national level, the approach to sterilization was quite similar in Wisconsin. In this state, sterilization was legalized in 1913 and was performed through the 1960s. Under this law, and during that time period, over 1,800 people were sterilized, making Wisconsin 11th in the nation for number of sterilizations performed. The laws in our state approving forced sterilization were not changed until 1978. Now that we've spent some time discussing the origins of the current current day sterilization policy, I would now look at sterilization's role in modern day society prior to evaluating the limitations and protections afforded by this rule. With more than 1/2 of the pregnancies in the U.S. being unintended, the need for effective contraception is clear. Currently, sterilization is the most commonly utilized method at 19% of the female population, compared to 13% using contraceptive pills and 10% using LARCs. While the current Medicaid policy applies to both men and women alike, for the purposes of this presentation, we will continue to focus on women's sterilization for 2 reasons. One is that female sterilization is disproportionately utilized compared to male sterilization. This difference exists despite vasectomies being less expensive and posing less risk to the patient compared to female sterilization. Vasectomies typically can be performed under local anesthetic, but do not carry a risk of ectopic pregnancy in the case of failure. Regardless, annually in the U.S., 1/2 to 3/4 million tubal sterilizations are performed every year, whereas vasectomies are performed at 1/3 the rate. Second, the majority of people in this room are women's healthcare providers who routinely perform and counsel for these procedures for female patients. While nearly 1 in 5 women have undergone sterilization, it is not equally utilized. Women with public or no insurance are 38% more likely to undergo sterilization than women with private insurance. Women who do not complete high school or have their GED are more than 4 times as likely to use sterilization as individuals who complete a bachelor's degree. Tubal sterilization rates also increase with age, with only 4% of women in their 20s compared to 39% of women in their 40s. Whether or not a woman undergoes a sterilization procedure is also in part determined by their rates of partner vasectomy. Non-Hispanic white males are 3.5 times more likely to undergo vasectomies. In a study of over 3,000 women and their partners, 14% of white women relied on partner sterilization compared to 5% of Hispanic and 4% of Black women. But even with this factor controlled for, Black women are still more likely than white women to undergo sterilization procedures. African American women are 43% more likely to use sterilization, even when other factors such as age, insurance, income, parity, education, religion, and relationship status are controlled for. I hope that by providing you all with the historical context and information regarding the current use of sterilization, we can better understand the initial intent behind the development of the policy and implications for today's society. I do believe that the people who developed the Medicaid policy over 40 years ago did so with the primary goal of protecting vulnerable populations. Even with that thought in mind, I would like to move next to a critical examination of the policy in modern day healthcare and the limitations it may impose on our patients. The first issue is with the form itself. This is not the simplest or more straightforward. At the Arboretum Clinic, where new providers are frequent, there's actually an example copy with all the pertinent fields highlighted to make sure that the resident physicians complete the form in the entirety with the patient. More experienced providers may not have that same difficulty, but we must remember for our patients, this is a form that they will likely only read once in their lifetime. That is, if they are able to understand it. Currently in the U.S., nearly 20% of the population has low English literacy. Furthermore, the average reading level in the U.S. population is comparable to a 7th or 8th grader's reading comprehension. The current Medicaid policy is written at a 9th grade reading level, and the overall comprehension is rated as poor on the readability and processability form. So can we do better? In 2011, Zeit performed a study which took the standard consent form and modified it, drafting an alternative which is then at a 6th grade reading level. 201 English-speaking women were randomized to either the standard or the modified form. After reading the form, the patients were asked these 5 following questions in order to assess if they had adequate knowledge of the consent process and implications for sterilization. So they were asked, how long does it have to be until I can get my tubes tied? If they are obligated to have sterilization now that they've signed the form, whether or not sterilization is easily reversible, if there are alternatives that are equally effective, and when the form expires. Although I was not able to get a copy of the simplified form from the primary author, the publication did report it altered both the language as well as the format of the form, but did not significantly alter the content. The modified form was associated with improved scores on the knowledge evaluation, including a 24% increase in the understanding of the waiting period. And perhaps most critically, the modified form included a 34% increase in comprehension of the expiration date. Less than 20% of people who completed the standard form understood that the consent expired in 6 months, compared to 52% in the modified group. This study did evaluate the patient's understanding independent of any physician or provider counseling, which is clearly not how care is provided. This does mitigate the generalizability of these findings somewhat, but regardless, I think this study does bring up an important point that the important information presented in the sterilization consent is presented in a way that's difficult for patients to understand. When asked at the end of the study if they would prefer the modified or the standard form, 94% of the women indicated that they preferred the modified form. Given that women with less education are more likely to seek permanent sterilization, the high reading comprehension required to understand the Medicaid forms presents a barrier to care. The patients most likely to seek this important information are the ones who are least likely to understand it. This can lead to both a decreased patient satisfaction and lack of understanding of both the waiting and the expiration periods. Perhaps because we are obstetricians, in practical experience, the 30-day waiting period comes up most often in terms of postpartum tubal sterilization procedures. And compared to interval tubals, where a 30-day waiting period is just one more hurdle in a jumble of surgery scheduling, medical clearance, and preoperative visits, immediate postpartum tubals are often unscheduled and unpredictable. We may be performing these procedures for patients who had a consult visit months ago or interacting with an obstetrician for the first time in the hospital. Research also demonstrates that postpartum tubals represent a majority of the sterilization procedures performed for Medicaid patients. In a 2013 review of sterilization practices in California and Texas, nearly 80% of the sterilization procedures Medicaid paid for were immediately postpartum. While I've had the personal experience of not being able to perform a tubal ligation due to the waiting period, my own conclusions are also supported in evidence. A large retrospective review of women seeking sterilization, for those with unfulfilled sterilization requests, inadequate consent forms or lack of valid consent forms were the reasons the requests were denied in 37% of cases. Other factors included lack of available operating room space for 6% of patients, and then for 15% other medical conditions. For those women who wanted sterilization but had unfulfilled requests, their rates of pregnancy were more than double at 46%, compared to 22% in a control group of women who had not requested tubal sterilization. Furthermore, a qualitative study of women who had unfulfilled requests demonstrated that women with invalid paperwork had increased rates of anxiety regarding future pregnancy. So what if there wasn't a waiting period? Recently, a model was created to compare the current Medicaid policy to hypothetical situations in which sterilization could be performed without a waiting period. The authors of this article estimated this would increase the number of fulfilled requests from 53 to 77%. This would decrease the number of inadvertent or unintended pregnancies by 29,000 and terminations by 10,000. This would also lead to $215 million in cost savings per year when comparing the average cost of a Medicaid sterilization versus the cost of prenatal, delivery, and postpartum cares, as well as infant care through 1 year of life. One limitation of this study is it did not estimate the risk of regret under this revised system. Lastly, but sometimes the most frustrating of all, is the need for a physical copy of the signed sterilization form. This is one more hurdle that patients and providers face in accomplishing desired sterilization. Although electronic medical records have helped with this, in areas of the country where paper records are still in use or EMRs are not integrated, this can still present a barrier to care. For example, is the form in the Meritor system, or is it her UW chart, or do we have to log into St. Mary's? In the study previously discussed regarding unfulfilled sterilization requests, 6 of the women were not able to get their tubals simply because the forms were not able to be found. Despite the drawbacks of the current system, we also must look to the protections that our current policy affords. While many of the risks of tubal sterilization are the same as any other procedure, infection, bleeding, one that is more unique to the surgery is the risk of regret. One of the most well-known studies in this area is the U.S. Collaborative Review of Sterilization, or CREST study, which followed 10,000 women for nearly 15 years after their sterilization. Over that time period, the researchers found that the risk of regret overall was 12.7%. Regret was positively correlated with the age of sterilization, with rates of over 20% for women who were 30 or under at the time of their sterilization versus 5.9% for women over 30. In that study, parity was not associated with regret rates, nor were post-abortion sterilization compared to interval procedures. For those undergoing postpartum sterilization, the risk of regret declined as the interval from delivery increased. Another study, which used the rate of tubal reversal information requests as a surrogate marker for regret, found that 14% of women requested this information after sterilization, while only 1% actually underwent the procedure. Regret was also positively correlated with relationship conflict at the time of sterilization, with a relative risk of 2.4 to 3.1%. And finally, a telephone survey of over 1,000 women found differing rates of sterilization regret by racial group. Participants in this study were women who had undergone sterilization and identified by random number dialing. In this study, rates of regret ranged from 25% in African American women to 59% in Native American women. The ACOG Practice Bulletin on Tubal Sterilization also reports that another risk factor for regret may be having less information about the procedure. There is data to suggest that many women completing the Medicaid sterilization form do not have an adequate grasp of the permanence of this procedure at the time of request. Insight study on health literacy, an alternative sterilization form, 35% of women in the standard group did not understand that the procedure was irreversible and permanent prior to engaging in physician counseling. This information could be used to argue that the current requirement for a physician and patient to sit down and review the sterilization form together ensures a discussion of critical information which could alleviate risk of regret in the future. Proponents of the current arrangements could also point to the continued targeting of vulnerable populations, that our current tubal sterilization requirements and waiting period are necessary protections or even need to be strengthened. For example, between 2006 and 2010, more than 140 women in the California prison system were sterilized in violation of state laws. Multiple reports were made regarding coercion by staff and medical providers. While proponents of this system stated that they were just trying to provide equal health care opportunities to incarcerated women compared to non-incarcerated women, there were also reports that women were targeted on the basis of their previous sentences. One former inmate, Crystal Wynn's response to this targeting was, quote, "Do they think that we're animals and they don't want us to breed anymore?" One additional viewpoint through which to judge and view the appropriateness of our current restrictions is in comparison to both sterilization policies in other countries, as well as U.S. policies for other major medical decisions. A 2002 review of international policies found that 74 countries have laws regarding sterilization for contraceptive purposes. Of those, 24 countries have age and parity guidelines that must be satisfied prior to procedure. The median age, or most common requirement, is 25 years old prior to undergoing sterilization, although in Slovenia, a woman has to be 35 in order to be sterilized. Several countries combine age and parity requirements, while 3 countries have parity requirements alone. In Panama, a woman must have 5 children in order to be sterilized. Internationally, it seems then our policy may be interpreted on the liberal side of things, but compared to our nearer neighbors, it does appear to have more restrictions. In Canada, guidelines are more individualized. Government resources regarding sterilization quote that some doctors may advise a waiting period between the time a woman requests a tubal ligation or tubal implants and the time the procedure is performed. This waiting period allows you to be certain about your decision. In the United Kingdom, the National Health Service guidelines state that counseling and consent for sterilization must occur at least 1 week prior to the procedure, i.e. during a cesarean delivery, and that patients requesting sterilization either in the post-abortion or postpartum period should be made aware of an increased risk of regret. Returning to the US, it does seem that there is an unequal emphasis put on certain reproductive decisions, including tubal sterilization. Pregnancy termination is obviously even more heavily regulated and also includes a waiting period. However, there are no federal laws governing egg harvesting or sperm donation or the consent process for these procedures. While a 2014 ASRM guideline for informed consent does advise discussing the risk of regret, very few laws mandate that donors be informed of the risks or potential uses for their gametes. To further contrast sterilization to other major medical decisions and procedures, there is no equivalent waiting period to undergo chemotherapy, major surgery, or withdrawal of life support. There is a waiting period under the Death with Dignity Act, but it is universally shorter than the 30 days required for tubal sterilization. Most states require 15 days between the first and second requests, and under Washington law, a patient must be informed of other options, including hospice and palliative care. So it is my goal that over the last half hour you've learned something new about the history of sterilization, or how unfulfilled requests affect our patients' lives, or even how our national policy compares to neighboring countries. Sterilization is just one piece, however, in a much larger conversation about reproductive justice, which focuses on the tenets of bodily autonomy, the ability to have children or to not have children. This movement was initially started in the early 1990s in response to lack of inclusion of women of color, LGBTQ women, trans people, incarcerated women, and women of low socioeconomic status in the mainstream fight for reproductive rights. Opinions about sterilization cannot be formed in a vacuum. They must be framed in the context of reproductive justice and contraception in general. For example, many clinicians hold LARCs in very high regard. We think of them as devices that empower our patients. They can lead their lives free of worrying about pregnancy, can positively impact their bleeding patterns, and even provide endometrial protection. However, on the introduction of Norplant, which is a predecessor to Nexplanon, it was utilized not only by the women's healthcare providers, but also by the judicial system. In 1990, a woman by the name of Darlene Johnson, a resident of California, was convicted of child abuse. The judge sentenced her to a 7-year prison sentence, or a 1-year sentence followed by probation, with the condition that she had the Norplant in place for the duration of her probation. In the years to follow, multiple other states proposed financial incentives to welfare recipients to have the Norplant placed. Although these measures were never passed, they serve as reminders that reproductive coercion is not a thing of the distant past. These stories are sobering reminders that unbridled enthusiasm and efforts to ensure our patients have access to contraception or sterilization may be misinterpreted or misused to further reproductive coercion of marginalized groups. In 2002, a telephone study of over 500 people demonstrated that 22% of Black women reported beliefs that, quote, poor and minority women are sometimes forced to be sterilized by the government. A qualitative study in 2017 of young Black and Latino women demonstrated that 71% of them had previously experienced pressure from a provider regarding contraception. Most of these participants described the pressures as subtle and not explicit coercion, leading to the coining of the term implicit pressure. An example of this is, so there was no conversation about options really. Like, I mean, she kind of mentioned things, but more or less she was just like, I'm gonna write you a prescription for the pill. For some, these experiences made patients reluctant to engage in care in the future or wary of other contraceptive methods. As we reach the end, one fact that I hope is clear is that access to sterilization and reproductive autonomy are complex topics that are worthy of our attention as women's healthcare providers. In the past, I had been struck by how the Medicaid tubal sterilization policy was a violation of the ethical principle of autonomy. By a lapse in paperwork, or scheduling this rigid and impersonal government standard can take away the choice from a motivated and informed patient. However, as I learned more about the previous and present violations of human reproductive rights, I can understand and appreciate that the intent was to uphold the non-malfeasance principle to ensure that women and men do not have their reproductive rights taken away without the consent. But in today's society, this has created a two-tiered system based on financial resources, which violates the principle of justice. Not only do women with private insurance now have more opportunities than those in government insurance, but those who may be at the highest risk of unintended pregnancy now have more barriers to undergo sterilization if they desire. Furthermore, sterilization not only offers a form of pregnancy prevention, but in the Nurses' Health Study, as well as a 2015 Swedish study of over 250,000 women, provides a reduction in ovarian cancer risk. Limiting access to sterilization for certain groups of women, therefore, may have long-term health implications. Therefore, in order to preserve the spirit of beneficence and uphold the principles of autonomy and justice, we must look to change our current policy. There have been several solutions proposed to address this current discrepancy in our healthcare. This is a challenging undertaking, as put by ACOG, quote, "The tension between liberal access and protective safeguards is difficult to ethically navigate and operationalize." One proposed change would be to reduce the waiting period for all patients back to the 72-hour limit. Another alternative would be to remove the 180-day expiration period and to create a national database in which all forms could be electronically accessed regardless of hospital, clinic, or scan records. Furthermore, revising the form to include more patient-friendly language to improve patient understanding of the process may help them be better advocates in their own healthcare decisions. Others have focused not so much on changes that would improve immediate access to postpartum sterilization, but broader changes to extend Medicaid insurance beyond the immediate postpartum period. This would improve access to interval sterilization if desired. Currently in Wisconsin, Badger Care Plus covers women for 60 days after delivery. However, some women are instead enrolled in Badger Care Plus prenatal for purposes of either immigration or legal status if they do not qualify for Badger Care Plus. This is a state program which covers all medical services during pregnancy, but the postpartum care is limited only to services covered by the Global Obstetrics Package, and their coverage ends on the last day of the month in which their pregnancy ends or they deliver. This can be a period of 24 hours. Extending insurance coverage beyond the first 60 days postpartum would not only allow providers to continue to take care of women who cannot or are unable to attend their postpartum visits. The median attendance for Medicaid-funded postpartum visits is 60%, and ours stated is 67%. This change would also alleviate any pressure patients may feel to undergo sterilization prior to their insurance coverage ending. In fact, just last week, Tennessee announced plans for a 3-year pilot to expand Medicaid coverage from 2 months to 1 year postpartum. This change was actually prompted by a large number of opioid overdoses and maternal deaths in the postpartum period, but if passed would have the additional benefit of increased access to contraception as well as addiction medicine care. But until these larger changes take effect, there are steps that each of us can do in order to ensure that our patients all have the outcomes that they desire. The first is encouraging patient autonomy in a positive sense by improving access to sterilization for those who desire. For providers with personal objections to sterilization, this means referring to providers who do feel comfortable offering such procedures. For those practicing at religious institutions or other hospitals that may have restrictions on sterilization, it means being familiar with these policies and procedures in order to not miss opportunities for desired sterilization, and once again, referral to providers who are able to perform that service. But for the rest of us, it means being cognizant of the current Medicaid restrictions and taking time to communicate those to patients in ways that they are able to understand. While discussing reproduction and contraception with patients, we must be careful not to bring any personal prejudice into the conversations. There are some women for whom pregnancy may be life-threatening due to other medical conditions such as cardiomyopathy or renal failure. For those patients, we must be clear in communicating our medical rationale for recommending against pregnancy. And for all women, we should discuss the risks of rapid repeat pregnancy to both mother and child. For all others, however, we must strive to avoid bringing into the clinical encounter conscious or unconscious gender, race, or class-based biases about who should become a mother. Similarly, we also must respect the wishes of patients who desire sterilization, even when the physician is concerned about a high risk of regret. Obstetricians used to use the rule of 120 to decide whether or not a woman was an appropriate candidate for sterilization. Their age and parity multiplied together must equal 120 in order to undergo the procedure. Today, however, we no longer use that rule, but we must take care to address any external pressures that would influence a woman's choice to seek sterilization, such as partner coercion, insurance coverage, and to thoroughly counsel about other options such as LARC use or male sterilization. Once those are addressed or excluded, we must acknowledge that our patients have great expertise in their own lives and that restriction of patient autonomy is worse than decisional regret. Our jobs as physicians are to counsel and inform our patients, but in the end, we must allow our patients to accept the dignity of risk. Lastly, we must remember that our ability to improve women's health care is not limited to the exam or the operating room. Our power to affect change cannot be underestimated. This can be an individual effort, such as a letter to a representative, or a collective endeavor, such as ACOG or Doctor's Day, which is happening in just a few months. Between the seemingly endless charting, training, and other administrative duties, it can be easy to be burned out. It is important to remember the enormous privilege that it is to take care of women, the trust that is placed in us, and the obligation we have to serve as their advocates. So my references, and thank you all very much for your attention. This is my questions? Yes, what?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you. This was very, very good and informative talk. I appreciate it. Also, just touching on what you were talking about the eugenics movement and reproductive justice and oppression in our research country. I also just want to put a plug for everyone for a book called Killing the Black Body, which is a really comprehensive and well-written book about the history of America in terms of reproductive oppression for Black women. And it goes through like each stage of our country starting back to slavery times. And I think it's an important contextual piece of information for us all to have when caring for our patients.
Dr. Ranieri.
From all the, looking at the presentation, from all the principles of ethical principles that if you are given a carte blanche to legislate or to whatever sounds fantastic, are you prepared to, in this issue, prioritize mine over all others?
Prioritize what?
Are you suggesting that you want to make autonomy the only principle that guards people like you?
No, I think it has to be a balance, and justice has to be a part of it as well. And I think if there was one simple solution, it already would have been done by now, or something would have changed by now. It's because I think it is so complex and you have so many stakeholders. And we have this history, all of these terrible things that happen to women that we forget sometimes. And so I think when we start to look more thoroughly at it and realize or discover that these things happened, you understand why this was put in place in the first place. I think my personal opinion is it would be great if Medicaid could be expanded to 1 year postpartum. I think that would be the best thing, but otherwise I would favor shortening the waiting period to 72 hours and eliminating the expiration date. Yeah. Because then it could be signed at their first prenatal visit if they wanted to. Now you have to wait. And that I don't see the benefit of the expiration date. And I couldn't find that in the literature either. Dr. Symphony?
Yeah, thanks for a great presentation. One of the things that I can think of that we can do now without waiting for law changes, et cetera, is trying our best to just get the tubals done postpartum in the patients who we're quite certain want them. They've got their papers for it, they're signed, they're ready to go, they're sure, they've been well counseled. So I think we, as providers and institutions have a failure rate at being able to deliver on that, like you mentioned, which is a real kind of part of the lack of ability to deliver on their requests. And one of those, the unpredictability of labor delivery and the resources needed, but how you view that procedure is also really important. And a lot of our colleagues and maybe ourselves even think it's elective, it's not that important, if we can do it tomorrow or we can do it before they create, but we all have the patients that we know well that really wanted this procedure done, and the NPO period is, it gets pushed from 8 hours to 15 hours to 20 hours, and then, they get frustrated and they're just done, and they go home without their sterilization. And they found more and more that anesthesia is pretty willing to at least consider doing it on a very short interval basis from delivery. I mean, traditionally in our institution, we waited until the day after delivery and kind of redone their regional anesthesia or given them a general, et cetera, where a lot of women, and some women may not want it immediately after delivery, we'd rather sort of but to increase access, if you can talk to your anesthesia partners and your attending hey, it might be a good time if we can just go an hour after delivery, leave her epidural on, continue to use her regional anesthesia and get to the OR, and just try to advocate for the patients that we're already sure want that so that they can not leave unserved.
Yeah, in a similar vein, I've also done a tubal sterilization for someone who's really not a good candidate for for immediate postpartum. She was morbidly obese, but she was on Care Plus prenatal, and her insurance was going to run out in 36 hours. And so we counseled her, obviously, that her mini lap was going to be a little bit bigger than the 3 centimeters, and she was willing to accept that risk because she had actually wanted a tubal after her last pregnancy, and then left the hospital without one. And so that was also something where you can change your counseling a little bit and allow the patient that choice and offer that as long as you think it's within the realm of what's medically appropriate, which it was, and it went very well. So, yes.
I think another important group of people is people who are childless and we but provide to make the decision that they're not able to because they don't have children. I've had patients like me in my office, they're so painful to get by these asthma pulling either tubes because a lot of providers have declined. That's another practitioner that you can
Yeah, there's a pretty good New York Times editorial about a woman who underwent sterilization in her 20s and now reflecting back on that in her 30s, and she had to go to 5. She went to 5 different doctors, and it was the 6th one that finally did it, and that was in the mid-2000s. So, and I have a family member who had that situation who didn't have kids and wanted to be sterilized, and her providers definitely, she had to jump through more hoops than someone who had had 2 kids. So. Dr. Happy.
So, in that whole 30-day consent form thing, and you have to wait 30 days. So say they signed it 27 days ago or whatever. And in my world, there's a lot of people who really shouldn't have more babies. So I've done this, I think, twice, maybe 3 times now. But if you read the final, the words, all the written words that are separate from that 30-day consent form, they define
As by the due date.
preterm by their due date. And so anybody delivered before they read it, which is all repeat C-sections, basically, actually qualify for 2 at 72 hours. And so, again, you read those fine words, it spells that out loud. So I just put all that into my note and justify why I'm doing it. And I not heard that they never got paid for it. And I always talk to the nurse manager, but I just recommended reading that yourself and looking through that and seeing if you feel comfortable, because I do think not all women need 30 days, and I think we could do a better job at getting people this with reading those terms and that interpretation. So I don't know if anyone else feels that way, but I talk about it once in a while, and I think as a department we could probably help more people if we concluded we all agree that.
Yeah, and the other part I learned about the fine print was if you sign, let's say someone comes in 36 weeks and they're going to deliver at 36 and 6 and you'd be in the 72-hour rule.
Yeah.
That's less than 30 days from their due date though, so that would not be, so there are some loopholes in that rule. So it has to be 30 days from their expected due date. It has to be signed even then with a waiting period of 72 hours. So that was a little bit more restrictive than I initially thought it was. Yes?
Thanks so much. That was amazing. I just feel like I know kind of a lot about this because we deal with this a lot in the clinic, and there are these nuances that I realize now that I have knowledge gaps in. And I'd love to see a patient simple fact sheet, one of those we call facts for you, that just lays out for patients in very simple language, this procedure is completely voluntary. It's just a simple patient fact sheet, because like you said, the MA consent form is confusing and not user-friendly, and private insurance patients see nothing. Right? So I would love to see a simple, uniform, easily readable form. And we need a provider fact sheet as well. So these issues like Dr. Coffey's bringing up are super important. They come up on labor and delivery, and we don't always have the time on busy LNG for to figure out the nuances of well, is it or isn't me is the most concerning piece is the disparity in the way that patients are treated. And so I would like to see there be some uniformity to ensure lack of coercion for all patients. So that's just my comment.
Yeah, and we had a case, it was not related to the MA consent form, but we had to call about another legal issue on labor and delivery. And I think Dr. Bennett had to call 3 times, and it took 2 or 3 hours to hear back from the lawyer. Granted, it was a weekend, but it's not as readily accessible to find those legal questions. And if you're busy, you might just say, okay, well, we can't do it then, And I don't think anyone would fault you if you're busy and you can't find the right answer. So sometimes the information isn't where it should be.
All right.